Oh, yes. My name is Ann Hagedorn. I'm an author, writer, journalist, and I live in Ripley, Ohio. Very honored to live here. And I write narrative nonfiction books for a living. I worked at the Wall Street Journal in New York for many years and then discovered Ripley, wrote a book about what happened here, and I've never left. Yeah.
I'm Betty Campbell, and I've lived in Ripley all my life. My roots are very deep in Ripley and in Brown County. I'm a descendant of the first permanent settler in Brown County who settled here in 1794. My maiden name was Dragoo, which is French. I like the small town, slower pace of living in Ripley as opposed to a city. But we're an hour from Cincinnati, so we can enjoy all the all that a large city has to offer just driving an hour from Ripley into Cincinnati.
I enjoy the most, I suppose, the timelessness. As a writer, it allows me to focus completely on whatever I'm writing, and I'm not distracted by a lot of events or noise or a desire to go downtown and spend an entire day shopping or going to movie theaters. You know, Ripley is a marvelous place for writers and artists, and there are a lot of artists here. There are painters and sculptors and musicians, lots of musicians. My husband's a musician, and it's just a place that I feel allows you to focus on what really counts in life, and whatever your quest is, you can focus on it. And a lot better than in a big city, but I also had the experience of living in New York City for 20 years, so possible my huge appreciation of this town is the contrast in between the two auras, you know. But mostly it's just the timelessness and the excitement of the history, and also the people we meet, because there's always someone knocking on the door in the summers, in the warmer months when the tour buses come, who wants to, you know, talk to the author of Beyond the River, or just wants to talk about what they've realized since they've been here. So that what happened here still has a presence that people tune into. What happened here historically fascinates people. So we meet people from all over the country, all over the world basically, who come to visit Ripley. And up on the hill, I'm sure somebody has told you that there are some people. There was a group from Venezuela a couple years ago who came up to the hill, and they took their sandals off. I gave a lecture up there, and the head of the group said, "Is it okay if they take their shoes off and their sandals off?" I said, "Perfectly fine." And I said, "But why?" And he said, because we believe that the hill where John Rankin lived is a thin space, which means a thin space between the material world and the spiritual world. And they just wanted to get a feeling for what had happened there. I just find that amazing. So, yeah.
Reverend John Rankin is probably the best known person to have ever lived in Ripley, and he's known because he was uh, an ardent abolitionist and an Underground Railroad conductor, and his home in Ripley was a station on the Underground Railroad for approximately 40 years. And fortunately for us, John Rankin wrote his autobiography, so we know a lot of factual information about what went on in his role as a conductor. And in his autobiography, he tells us that over about a 40-year period, he and his family aided about 2,000 fugitive slaves escaping through their farm home. And he writes, "I never lost a passenger."
There are a lot of people who come here who know about Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and all the East Coast famous William Lloyd Garrison. But what they don't know is that William Lloyd Garrison, who's a very famous abolitionist from Boston, his mentor was John Rankin. So this part of the country was very important in working with the East Coast abolitionists. And so that's another thing people should know, is that this whole area, they called it the borderland, along the Ohio River, all these places, Madison, Indiana, Marietta, Ohio, Rising Sun, Indiana, Ripley. Ripley was the major hub, but they called Ripley the abolitionist hellhole. That was its nickname among the slave catchers and the pro-slavers.
Reverend Rankin chose to be an Underground Railroad conductor mainly because it was because of his religious belief. He believed that you cannot own another human being, and he really spent a lifetime trying to put an end to the issue of slavery. But why is he and these other Ripley conductors and others putting everything they value on the line, and their lives at times, to aid and shelter people that they've never met before? Once they hand them off to other conductors, they're never going to meet them again. They're probably never going to know the outcome of their story. Why would they do that? And it's because they felt so strongly that you cannot own people. The early founders in Ripley were many times men who had fought in the Revolutionary War. What had they just done? Fought for American independence. And they couldn't turn their backs on the fact that there were other people living in the areas where they did that were not free. And they felt that that was totally wrong, and they did whatever they could to right that wrong.
Can you talk about John Parker now?
John Parker, wow. Yes, well.
John Parker is not a native of Ripley, but he is one of the famous men to have lived in Ripley because he was also an Underground Railroad conductor. But he's unusual as a conductor in Ripley because he was born into slavery and was able to buy his freedom and settle in Ripley, Ohio, and work as an Underground Railroad conductor. He also had a very successful foundry business. He was an inventor. He invented farm equipment and was only one of a handful of African Americans to own patents on his inventions before the year 1900. So he's very unusual. In his role as a conductor, he's famous for taking his skiff and rowing back across the Ohio River and going into Kentucky and bringing fugitive slaves out. It's very daring and very bold because he and other conductors, had he been caught and convicted in court in Maysville, Kentucky, he would have paid a fine and could have spent as long as 6 months in jail.
I was really fascinated by his transition from not wanting really anything to do with slavery, especially after having been a slave, and then living on the Ohio River and meeting people who were trying to end slavery, meeting them, working with them, and realizing what a contribution he could make. He was a Renaissance man. That's the best way to describe John Parker. You know, he had courage, he had intelligence, he was an avid reader. He had a renowned library. He had a fabulous library, and people in this town would go and spend time in his library. He also was a mentor for other African Americans who later became well known. And, his children all got excellent educations. His girls went to Mount Holyoke. And, he was just an exceptionally bright and courageous man. When I interview people, I always ask them, what was your turning point? And I think if I were to interview John Parker, I think he would probably describe his turning point in the time he lived in Cincinnati, and someone came to him and asked him to help them. A person who was, I think, kind of stuck in a difficult situation close to here in Maysville, Kentucky. And I think that was the turning point for him. Every day, the gentleman who wanted Parker to help him would come for several days and ask him, and Parker would say, no, he wasn't going to get involved in that. He was free, and he was starting a business. He was very excellent at what he did, and 3 days of being asked, and finally he said yes. And probably in his mind he thought, I will do this once and that's it. But probably, like a lot of people, it changed him.
Living in Ripley now, I like being a resident of Ripley. It's everything you would think a very small town would be. We're close-knit. We, like other small communities, we come to each other in times of need. We're kind of a live and let live community. If that's your thing, we're okay with it. As long as you don't harm anything or anybody. But I think most of the citizens are very proud of our past and the role that we played in the Underground Railroad movement. We're hopeful for the future. I think it's going to be tied to our history and also to our position on the Ohio River and all the recreational possibilities that go along with being a town located right on the Ohio River. So we are hopeful for Ripley's future.
We recently had a very bad storm, and there were workmen immediately at one of the branches of the library, at one of the banks, to help out with a pipe problem. Here in this house, we had a frozen pipe problem. People here just right away. So that there's I think the community, the concept of a community that this town was built on, is still alive and well. And there are, political differences. I don't agree with all my neighbors politically, but we transcend that, because I think when you live in Ripley, you really sort through all the components of life and you realize what counts. And so, yes, politics is very important, but so is the respect for your neighbor who might think differently. And so that's built into the framework of the community of this town. The fact that an Underground Railroad worker participant lived in this house. The next house was a slave catcher. The next house, Underground Railroad, many years ago. So differences in political views can be very intense, but there is a strong sense of community and a respect for individuality around here that is timeless. And I think part of it has to do with the fascination and love of that river. I really do. I get teary-eyed, sorry. the river grabs us, and it because of its timelessness,